I'm an archivist. That means I look after archives, historic documents, and I work in the Houses of Parliament, where we look after the historic documents of the House of Commons and the House of Lords, about 4 million records going back more than 500 years. And I'm also a historian, so that means as well as looking after the documents, I do research into them. And my area of research is women and Parliament in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And I don't just mean women MPs, important though they are. I mean women interacting with Parliament in all sorts of ways, as staff working in the building, like myself today, as women who came to watch Parliament and find out what happened there, as women who came to Parliament as experts and advisors to give evidence to select committees, perhaps, and women who came to Parliament to lobby and campaign, like the suffragists, the peaceful campaigners for votes for women, and also the suffragettes, the militant activists. I believe that knowing your history is a bridge to understanding the present and the future. That if you know more about where you've come from, you're more likely to understand where you are today and think about what you might do in future. And I'm here today because I've got a great piece of history to tell you about. I'm going to tell you about the ventilator, the cage, and the tomb. These are 3 historic spaces in Parliament used by women. And as well as being really interesting in their own right, together they form a narrative over the last 200 years and explain how things have progressed in Parliament in that time, in some ways, less so in others, and helps us think now about where we might go in future. So, my 3 spaces. First of all, we have the ventilator. So, 200 years ago, if you were a woman and you wanted to come to the House of Commons and find out what was happening, you were banned from sitting in the public galleries. It might sound outrageous today, but back then it wasn't the right that we assume it to be now. And today, of course, we can watch what happens in Parliament on TV, online, on the web, on social media. Back then, if you wanted to find out what was happening, you had to be there. But because women were banned from the public galleries, they found another way of watching debates. They found their way up to the attic space above the House of Commons chamber, and they watched debates through the ventilator. Now, the ventilator was an octagonal structure, and it had holes in it, and women would physically put their heads through the holes and look down into the House of Commons chamber below. And the view wasn't great. The sound probably wasn't great either. And candle smoke and fetid smells would rise up from the House of Commons in the faces of these women watching them. But they had no choice, and it was a ventilator if they wanted to find out what's happening. So if, for example, you were Elizabeth Fry, the prison reformer, or Hannah More, the anti-slavery campaigner, and you had causes, you wanted to find out what they were saying about these things, you had to go up to the ventilator. The women up there were the wives, the daughters, the sisters and the mothers of the male MPs down below a lot of the time. And they knew the politicians well. They talked about going to the ventilator, and they commented on whether people had spoken ill or spoken well. These were politically engaged women, many of them. And in a way, it's a bit like having an all-female chat room or social media, so live blog, commenting on what was going on down below. And it's a really interesting all-female space right there in the heart of Parliament, this incredibly masculine building. So the ventilator is no more. It was destroyed by fire in 1834, a great fire that burnt down the Houses of Parliament. And when they built the new Houses of Parliament, they built the second space that I'm going to tell you about today, the cage. So the cage. So by now, it was accepted that women needed a better place to watch debates from than an attic, and they built a ladies' gallery. But the ladies' gallery was completely separate from the men, completely on the opposite side of the chamber, high up above the Speaker's chair. And it quickly became known as the cage because it had heavy metal grills over the window. Now, the grills were placed there deliberately so the women could see out by leaning forward and peering down through the holes. But the men, down in the chamber below, couldn't see the women watching them, which might have distracted them. This created a harem effect, a deliberate harem effect right here in the middle of London. The suffragists and the suffragettes spent many hours up in the cage watching debates, finding out what was happening down there. And it was very hot and stuffy and smelly because of the grills over the window. The ventilation, again, was very bad. Millicent Fawcett, the great suffragist campaigner, said it was a grand place for getting headaches. And suffragettes in 1908 one day chained themselves in a protest to that hated grill. The cage is also no more. It was destroyed in Second World War bombings. But the grills, in fact, do survive because they were removed 100 years ago in the summer of 1917. And the reason they were moved was because by this point it was clear that shortly some women would get the vote, become citizens. And at this point, some of these old practices started to seem a bit outmoded. And this brings us to my third space that I'm telling you about today, the tomb. So in 1918, some women got the vote, and the same year, women were also allowed to become MPs. And the parliamentary authorities, in readiness, set up a lady members' room for them to use when they came to the Houses of Parliament. And the first woman MP to be elected didn't take her seat. Constance Markovic, she was a Sinn Féin MP, so she never came to Westminster. The following year, though, 1919, Nancy Astor was elected, and she became the first woman MP to take her seat and the first woman to use the lady members' room. Now, it became nicknamed the Tomb, and the reason for this is because it was grim and foreboding, like a Victorian schoolmarm's room. It was described, it had heavy wood panelling, uncomfortable chairs, one coat hook for how many women needed to use it, no bath, and a quarter-of-a-mile walk to the nearest toilet. And at first, Nancy Astor had it all to herself. But a year later, the first woman Liberal MP arrived, Margaret Wintringham. Astor was a Conservative, but even though they were from different political parties, they were expected to share the lady members' room, gender trump party. This would never have happened to male MPs. A couple of years later, the first Labour women arrived, and they too are expected to share the lady members' room. And the lady members' room, it changes, adapts and improves a bit over the years, but basically continues in existence like this until the 1970s. So politicians like Margaret Thatcher, Barbara Castle and Shirley Williams would have used the lady members' room in one of its incarnations. And if there weren't enough desks for the number of women MPs that needed to use them, they were expected to sit on the floor or out in a corridor and do their constituency casework and have meetings there. It should be said that many male MPs didn't have offices of their own in this period either, but they had access to all the bars, the smoking rooms, the clubs nearby in Westminster that women were either formally or informally excluded from. There are still lady members' rooms today, but fortunately they don't have the same meaning because they are now other spaces women to use. They have their own offices in Parliament today. So that's my three historic spaces, the ventilator, the cage and the tomb. So why does any of this matter? Because we've come a long way since then, after all, haven't we? We now, at least in theory, have parliamentary equality in Parliament. We no longer have to watch debates segregated in a ventilator or through a cage. We don't have to work in the tomb. We've now had women in the highest positions in Parliament, Betty Boothroyd as Speaker of the House of Commons, and we've had 2 female Lord Speakers in the House of Lords, all of those women elected by their peers. And yet, with issues such as the gender pay gap and workplace harassment very much in the news at the moment, have we really come so far? Have we in fact replaced our physical grills that we can see with invisible metaphorical grills that we cannot see but are nonetheless still real? So 2018 marks some really important parliamentary anniversaries. It's 100 years since some women got the vote, but only some women. You had to be over the age of 30, meet a minimum property qualification. It was another 10 years till 1928 before women got the vote on the same terms as men. 2018 also marks 100 years of women MPs. Fantastic, but numbers were tiny, really small right through the 20th century until 1997. And even today, we are still a long way off the 50-50 Parliament. 2018 also marks 60 years of women in the House of Lords. Only 60 years. Women have only been allowed to be members of the House of Lords since 1958. So why is change so slow, and what are the problems still today? Last year, Professor Sarah Childs published a report called The Good Parliament, which identified barriers to women's participation in Parliament. And some of these barriers are to do with infrastructure, facilities, things like facilities for breastfeeding, childcare, and some are to do with working practices and lack of maternity and paternity leave, the problems with long working hours in the House of Commons, and lack of flexible working, job sharing, that kind of thing, where we have made a lot of progress in all these areas, but a lot more remains to be done. And until we manage to progress further with some of these issues, we do not have a gender-sensitive Parliament. So as we look forward to 2018, we can mark the centenaries and we can celebrate the achievements of the last 100 years. But we should also remember the ventilator, the cage and the tomb, and think about where our 21st century ventilator, cage and tomb might be today. Thank you very much.